The massive military and economic might of the People's Republic of China is constrained by the Gobi Desert to the north, Siberia and North Korea to the northeast, Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries to the south, and India and the Himalayas to the southwest and west. Only to the southeast toward the South China Sea does China have unfettered access to the rest of the world, an access that it desperately needs for its economy to flourish. But even there, China is hampered by something called the First Island Chain. This is a chain that China wants to break through. Even if they were able to do that, they'd find themselves constrained by a different set of islands further away. But why is China so afraid of these islands, and where does the US come into the equation? In 1823, U.S. President James Monroe invoked a concept later to be known as Manifest Destiny in a speech presented to Congress in which he warned European nations, specifically Great Britain, France, and Spain, not to interfere with America's imminent westward expansion. Monroe pulled no punches as he unilaterally declared that any attempt by Europeans to colonize the American continents, as he described them, would be seen as potential acts of war. This dual policy of a God-given right to an American sphere of influence in North America, combined with a promise of non-intervention in European affairs, became known as the Monroe Doctrine. It wasn't until 1845 that the term Manifest Destiny would be coined almost simultaneously in two different printed publications. In the July-August 1845 issue of the Democratic Review, followed almost immediately in nearly an identical context in a July 1845 article, the New York Morning News. This term meant the inalienable course, some would argue their God-given right, to populate the areas west toward the Pacific Ocean. Following the U.S. Civil War, the Monroe Doctrine would be expanded to cover future U.S. intervention throughout Latin America and was even invoked by some politicians and diplomats to counter the Soviet Union's efforts to expand their influence into Latin America during the Cold War period from the 1950s through to the 1980s. This doctrine went hand in hand with the concept of Manifest Destiny and declared that both North and South America were the stomping grounds of the U.S. alone. The problem with the Manifest Destiny concept is that it completely crushed the rights of the indigenous Native Americans who already occupied those lands, as well as the Spanish settlers who had arrived centuries before the residents of the initial 13 colonies made it to mainland North America. In the words of the Cato Institute, the Monroe Doctrine, which instructed the Europeans to stay out of the Americas, was coldly and unashamedly self-interested. President Monroe laid out his position and that of future U.S. presidents with a decidedly blinkered viewpoint. We should consider any attempt on Europe's part, to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. Monroe never mentioned how much peace and safety would be extended to the people already living in the areas that the U.S. would eventually overrun. Today, China is facing its own moment of Manifest Destiny and are using many of the same self-serving arguments in order to push forward their own claims. They claim almost the entirety of the South China Sea as theirs, claiming that their trading ships back in the 16th century regularly went through these waters, which they then claim gives them exclusive rights to control the vast area. But recently they've gone even further to solidify their claims: China's efforts to conquer the South China Sea. Throughout the South China Sea, China's military has occupied a number of barren atolls and even some underwater reefs and shoals and built them up to house air bases and military ports, literally dredging up sand and rock from the ocean floor to make these islands habitable. 7 of these bases are in an area west of the Philippines called the Spratly Islands, a 175,000 square mile area with more than 750 islands and reefs that combined barely total more than 3 square miles of actual above-surface terrain. The Spratlys are such a widely spread out island chain that they're claimed in part by 6 different nations: China, the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei. Most of the island chains are within the Philippines' 200-mile Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, while significant portions are also within the EEZs of Vietnam and Malaysia. Yet, China has decided to position permanent military bases on these 7 islands that were once partly or completely underwater. These island bases are part of a Chinese effort to occupy enough territory to defend a disputed interpretation of the South China Sea known as the Nine-Dashed Line. This area, extending more than 800 miles from China's coast, is significant to China's economic future. Not only are vast fishing areas and untapped oil reserves in the area, something that all 6 nations are fighting over, but China's economic and national interest also demand they be able to control shipping through the area. Since the 1980s, more than half of the world's supertanker traffic by tonnage passes through the region's water every year. Tanker traffic through the South China Sea is over 3 times greater than through the Suez Canal and 5 times greater than through the Panama Canal. Up to 1/4 of all the world's crude oil passes through the South China Sea on its way to China, which imports up to 70% of its oil and natural gas, as well as 65 to 70% of its food for its massive population. China's also been threatening military action against the island of Taiwan, which Beijing claims is now and has always been a province of China. The Taiwanese, however, don't see it that way and have clung to their precarious freedom since their government retreated there following the Chinese Communist takeover of mainland China in 1949. Taiwan, ruled by the Republic of China, or the ROC, as opposed to mainland China's government known as the People's Republic of China, or PRC, represents a significant link in what's known in China as the First Island Chain, stretching from Japan to Taiwan and then south to include portions of the Philippines and further south to Indonesia. This area is perceived by China with the same manifest destiny-tinted glasses as theirs by ordained right, just as the U.S. previously saw all the land between the Mississippi and the West Coast as ultimately theirs to conquer and control. But despite all the Chinese military bluster surrounding Taiwan and beyond their efforts to occupy and conquer, there is another set of islands in the east that pose a bigger threat to China's economic future. They contain no Chinese bases, no military buildup, no ancient historical pretext of ownership, in fact, nothing for which China can lay claim to, the way that they've tried to claim so much of the South China Sea. And yet, these few islands perhaps remain more of a threat to China's future than Taiwan and the Spratlys combined, and few people in the West have ever heard their names. The worst-kept secret between China and the West. They're called the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, a mostly north-to-south oriented archipelago of around 572 islands on the very eastern edge of the Bay of Bengal. They lie only 22 nautical miles from Myanmar, also known as Burma, to the north, and 99 miles from Indonesia to the south. They've been considered part of India for centuries, at least since 800 AD, when the Chola dynasty had influence over the islands during their 400-year rule. When Great Britain subjugated India from the late 1850s through to 1947, England used these islands as a convenient penal colony. When India gained its independence after World War II, England wanted to retain ownership of the islands, but India persuaded them that the islands had been an integral part of India economically for more than 2 millennia and were necessary for India's defense of the Bay of Bengal and the greater Indian Ocean to their immediate west. What makes these sparsely populated islands so important to both India and China are their location. The archipelago sits strategically at the entrance of the Malacca Strait, the world's busiest shipping route. In a time of crisis, India would be able to blockade the Straits of Malacca, the Lombok Strait, or the Sunda Strait using elements of the Indian Navy based out of Port Blair, in conjunction with the navies of Indonesia, Vietnam, and other Asian nations. Just as China is doing with the 7 islands of the Spratly Islands, India has decided that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands archipelago would make excellent positions not just for naval support and resupply, but also as unsinkable aircraft carriers. They also have the capability to support radar installations that, with tall enough towers, can see over the horizon farther than any ship-based radar system. Relations have steadily deteriorated between India and China since a series of violent border clashes in a disputed region in the Himalayas erupted in 1957 and grew worse in 2020. Both sides want to maintain control of the vital deepwater narrows that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands protect. Military improvements on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Aware of the future role that the area can have in keeping an eye on China's naval force projection, India has taken steps to build up the infrastructure on the archipelago. India's Andaman and Nicobar Command, ANC, established in 2001, is the only tri-service theater command, integrating air, naval, and army forces of the Indian Armed Forces. Based at Port Blair near the southern tip of the Andaman Islands group, the command was created to oversee and coordinate India's strategic interests in the nearby Strait of Malacca to the east and the South China Sea beyond. This base allows for rapid deployment of military assets in the event of hostilities anticipated to come primarily from China. The base provides logistical and administrative support to naval ships which are sent on deployment to East Asia and the Pacific Ocean. The Andaman and Nicobar Command includes INS Jarawa, a modern naval base of the Indian Armed Forces located in Port Blair at the southern tip of South Andaman, which is the territory's only populated town. The base was commissioned in 1964 and has undergone recent upgrades and improvements. INS Utkrosh is the adjacent naval air station, which is concerned with operating defense and reconnaissance craft for the region, while INHS Dhanvantari serves as a naval hospital for the base. Port Blair also has the services of Floating Dock Navy, FDN-1, of nearly 40,000 tons, large enough to service all but the biggest ships in the Indian Navy. while a second smaller floating dock, FDN2, was ordered in 2010. Port Blair is a 2 to 3 hour flight from mainland India via Port Blair's Veer Savarkar International Airport and 3 to 4 days by sea to reach the eastern coastal cities of India. China's regional response. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands aren't the only islands in the area that have seen an increase in military attention. Just off the southwest coast of Myanmar lies Great Coco Island, a small, remote island only 8 miles long. It's also just 45 miles north of the northern sections of the Andaman Islands. Great Coco Island, the largest part of the Coco Islands chain, has been allegedly leased to the People's Republic of China since 1994, though China calls such a claim laughable. Despite the island's tiny size and China's protestations to the contrary, it's nevertheless big enough for someone to clandestinely build a brand new 7,500-foot runway. Signs of construction have provoked concern that China, to which the military junta of Myanmar has grown increasingly dependent on following their February 2021 coup, would use the location to gather intelligence on the Indian Navy either through espionage or via a constellation of radar dishes placed there similar to the buildup on their 7 contested Spratly Island bases. And as with China's militarization in the Spratlys, there are fears that a larger military presence will follow, using the newly installed runway and port facilities as a wedge in the door to a greater military presence needed to protect those facilities. Greater Coco Island and the 7 Spratly bases aren't the only places where China is positioning its military to control the high seas. They've also begun building up a naval station in Cambodia at a location called Reem Base in the Gulf of Thailand, close to the strategically important Malacca Strait. As with Great Coco Island, China denies they're building a naval facility there, but real-time geospatial satellite surveillance is now available to refute those denials. Black Sky, a US-based persistent global monitoring service, a private satellite company not unlike SpaceX's Starlink, though on a much more specialized scale, has been able to gather intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance or ISR data on Reem Base, proving that China is building up the location with a big investment in men and material. As with the Spratlys, Reem Base will be able to support large naval vessels with additional structures still in the building phase. Interestingly, the satellite images show 2 piers under construction, the longest of which extends more than 2,200 feet in length, with almost 1,000 feet of usable docking space. This one pier is being developed with a distinctive angled shape, a feature not seen at every staging area, but present at China's only other major naval base in foreign waters on the coast of the African city of Djibouti. The Djibouti base was the first China built away from the South China Sea. Its construction began in 2016, during which time China protested that it wasn't building anything militarily connected there. By 2022, there were 2,000 permanent Chinese military personnel there, and their angled dock, identical to the one being built in Cambodia at its new Reem base, is deemed large enough to handle one of China's 3 new aircraft carriers. As with the 7 island bases in the South China Sea, China first claimed its base in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa was going to be a civilian project and denied any implication that it was going to be militarized. Djibouti is strategically situated by the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which separates the Gulf of Aden from the Red Sea and oversees the southern approaches to the Suez Canal. The location is significant not just to China. The US operates its own base, Camp Lemonnier, just to the south, along with the French, who have their own base Ariane 188, primarily for the French Air Force, while Japan maintains a self-defense force base Djibouti right next door. The beginning of the construction of this base in 2016 and its implications for further militarization of the region by China prompted the African-based Peace Security Council, or PSC, to issue a warning about allowing future foreign military bases in their countries. The council urged member countries to be cautious when entering into agreements that would lead to the establishment of foreign military bases in their country. Despite these concerns, the African continent has become a host to an increasing number of foreign military bases and logistics hubs, primarily as a direct result of trade and economic agreements between a few African Union member states and China. China's massive Belt and Road Initiative. Along with these major military bases which, remember, China has always claimed weren't for military purposes until they were completed and then, whoops, they really are military bases. China is also involved in hundreds of smaller projects throughout Asia and Africa. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched by Chinese President Xi Jinping during a visit to Kazakhstan and Indonesia in 2013, was initially a 2-pronged program: the Overland Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road. The 2 complementary sections were originally referred to as the One Belt, One Road Initiative, but eventually became the Belt and Road Initiative, known as the BRI. The BRI is a multi-billion-dollar program that funnels Chinese building projects into agreeable countries. Everything from railroads and highways to complete ports and airports are built, which are then taken over by the Chinese government when the poorer countries inevitably can't repay their building loans. If this sounds suspiciously like a crime syndicate taking over a business because they can't pay a loan shark, that's because it is exactly like that. The program is currently the primary method with which China is increasing its presence around the world. In the bigger picture, this is China's global plan, both for projecting power into new regions, primarily Central Asia and Africa, while also working to ensure unfettered access to the countries where it seeks raw materials. The initiative oversees a funding pool as large as $67.8 billion in 2022, which was a slight decrease from 2021. The amount funds over 200 separate projects in 147 countries, many of which are currently losing money. These losses may send several of the host countries into bankruptcy. One example is Pakistan, whose indebtedness is currently at $62 billion, of which 80% has been financed by China. This indebtedness is fueled in part by the high cost of the BRI projects, combined with the high rate of interest China is charging. And here is where Djibouti returns to the picture. The 2018 International Monetary Fund assessment pointed out that the building program they had agreed to with China increased external debt for the country from 50% of GDP to 85%, the highest of any low-income country. Much of this debt is owed to China's Exim Bank and consists of a government-guaranteed public enterprise debt for things like the new Chinese-built port. If Djibouti defaults on its debt, the contracts put in place allow China to assume ownership of the facilities. Many other BRI countries have identical clauses in their own contracts. It's not just Africa and Andaman and Nicobar Islands, though. There are worries about other small island chains seeing an undue military influence as China and India vie for regional positioning. The Maldives, a small, strategically located archipelagic nation in the southwestern Indian Ocean, lies only 370 miles from India's nearest coastline. The island nation is embroiled in a diplomatic tug-of-war between the two Asian powerhouses. While India has been conducting military exercise with the Maldives' tiny 2,500-man military, China has made its desire known to place military bases there, which India has naturally responded negatively to. The problem is that the Maldives, like many other Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean island chains, is an archipelago of low-lying islands, reefs, and atolls. According to World Bank, with the future sea levels projected to increase in the range of 10 to 100 centimeters by the year 2100, the entire country could be submerged. But as we've seen with China's creation of artificial islands, that's no deterrent to a sufficiently motivated military with deep enough pockets and sufficient dredging machinery. Despite its relatively small above-water footprint and the threat of global sea level rise, the Maldives become the latest location where both China and India want military control. In 2013, the island saw the rise of the authoritarian Abdul Amin, who agreed to a series of infrastructure projects as part of China's budding BRI program. By 2018, Beijing had completed a major upgrade of the Maldives' main international airport, including, as we've seen before, a new 11,000-foot runway, long enough to handle the biggest of China's bomber fleet. These improvements have come at a high cost for the Maldives. China's loans have saddled the country with nearly $1.5 billion in debt, a high figure for a nation with a GDP of less than $9 billion. More recently, India has stepped in and allocated up to $1.4 billion to help pay off the country's debt. This is a similar tactic to Japan's grant of $3.4 billion to India to help them build the necessary energy grid to keep the Andaman and Nicobar Islands fully functioning. Japan sees a strong Indian presence in these islands as a vital means of reining in China's growing presence in the region. This program, launched in 2021, is expected to be completed by early 2024. India's naval partners. The need for Japan to help India fund its control over the islands highlights what some analysts see as an underfunded state of a vital choke point. These analysts perceive that India has neglected the necessary infrastructure for the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, in part because of their 800-mile distance from the mainland. India's land-based forces have been prioritized after the serious clashes along its borders with China. Funding for the Navy was focused on strengthening India's immediate coastline defense, while the island's potential was something that would have been taken care of in the indeterminate future. However, just as Taiwan won't have to go it alone against all of China's expanding navy, India has partners on its side as well. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad for short, is a military partnership sometimes dubbed the Asian NATO. It's made up of the 4 countries of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. The Quad's inception began with the SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which really was originally thought of as an Asian NATO by its organizers. In that respect, it was planned to be a strictly defensive organization. Where NATO was created to unify defense against Soviet Russia's expansionist aims, CETO was similarly created to coordinate a united defense against perceived Chinese aggression. Following the massively destructive 2004 tsunami that ravaged many Indian Ocean countries, the U.S. set up a working group of nations to coordinate disaster relief to the hardest-hit areas, including India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. This core group that would oversee relief efforts included India, Australia, Japan, and, of course, the U.S. The Quad members reiterated support for the principles that underlie a previous regional group known as ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Their principles for free trade and unfettered access to the world's oceans, as well as mutual economic and diplomatic ties, were more easily implemented by those four major economic powers. Their leadership would strengthen engagement with other ASEAN organized efforts, including the ASEAN Regional Forum and the annual East Asia Summit. Just as the U.S. would not be denied its vision of manifest destiny, there is every reason to believe that China will continue to operate in the same way. The U.S. had a problem early in its history that China does not currently have. That is, when President Monroe foresaw the continent fully under American sway, he didn't have the military might to back it up. However, China has a growing and modernizing army and navy, with a nuclear missile stockpile that's increasing almost as fast. While other countries like Japan, Australia, and India are trying to keep pace, China has gained economic and diplomatic partners in their race to build military bases in many far-off locations, including Africa, Central Asia, and potentially even South America. China has already spent more than $1 billion on their Belt and Road Initiative, which is designed to link together many of the countries that they'll need to supply them with the raw materials their country will need well into the rest of the 21st century. If India wants to put a collar on this new dragon, then the Andaman and Nicobar Islands will be one significant part of that collar. But they won't be able to stand up by themselves against the massive military might that China possesses. They'll need the assistance of its regional allies, especially the three other members of the Quad: Japan, Australia, and of course the United States. Now you need to watch Russia and China versus NATO, or watch this video instead.